Welcome to this presentation on the art of political science research. And really, a lot of folks would call this philosophy of science, but I like to say, look, there's an aspect of social science research that is got kind of a technique and art to it. And I want to just talk a little bit about what that is. Now, I like The Martian, right? And so Matt Damon in The Martian plays a character who, as he says, sciences the shit out of his problems, right? And so, that's kind of the model, right? But when we talk about being a social science, we're trying to get as close to what people tend to think of as science. But there's a couple problems in our way, and I want to talk about what they are and how we deal with them. So, first of all, what is scientific inquiry? And with regard to social science, King, Cohen, and Verba in their book on social science inquiry said, look, scientific research is designed to make descriptive or explanatory inferences based on empirical information about the world, right? And I like to go with more the explanatory side of that we're going to make inferences about the world based on empirical information. And that's what we try to do in social science. That's what distinguishes us from history or what is actually an art, right, or humanities. We're trying to have some kind of inferences about the world based on empirical information. Another way to put it was William Riker, not the guy from Star Trek. Was actually he was the founder of the University of Rochester's political science department, or well, not the founder, but an influential guy there, and was one of the people that I studied under. And he taught a course on the scope of political science. And I asked him, I said, there's so many different techniques being used by different people. What's the key thing? What are we trying to do? What distinguishes what we try to do here? And he said, well, when we utter a sentence about reality, we do something to prove it's right. And I immediately called him and said, but you've been saying we don't prove anything. And he goes, don't worry, get wrapped around the axle about that part of it. But the idea is we utter sentences about reality, and then we try to do something to figure out whether they're right. No better way to say it, to test whether they're right. Now, our problem as social scientists is it's the social part. We are dealing with people, and humans have agency, and we are not like a physicist who's dealing with particles or molecules or amoeba or something that doesn't really make a choice. It just acts, and it generally acts the same way all the time. We're focusing on people, and people have a capacity to make choices. And so human action is not deterministic. Everyone doesn't react the same way to the same thing. Like we would expect electrons to always act the same way, humans, not so much. People make up their minds, and sometimes they change them. Over history, although people debate how much it changes, over time, people have different thoughts, different ideas about the way the world works. And so we change them. An individual can change their mind in a short time span. Lots of people can change their attitudes over time. And so we know that different people act differently, and maybe people act differently at different times. So we have all sorts of problems with what we're focusing on. One example would be, when dealing with voters, right? What's a voter, right? Is it someone who's registered to vote? That's one part of it, and that could be an objective thing. But, when you're trying to do polls, you have to say, hey, is this person likely to vote? Right? Because most people don't actually go vote. And so you could be talking to someone, and sure, they're going to say they're going to vote, but are they actually going to do it? That is one of the things that really makes polling difficult with undecided voters. Are they going to decide between now and the election? Are they actually going to go vote? They're going to tell you they're going to vote, but are they actually going to do it? We also have observational constraints. It is difficult / impossible to experiment sometimes. We can't say, all right, if we want to see what makes a presidential candidate win, you can't do an experiment with one candidate versus another, right? Like you could do with rats in a maze or chemicals or other things, right? In the hard sciences they do. And so it can be impossible to you can't say, let's take a sample of countries that some are democracies, some aren't. Let's see if they go to war and then have a control group. No. The other thing is, it can be unethical to experiment with people, right? And so that's the other side of it. Even if you can experiment with people, it can be very unethical to do it. And so there's a lot of restrictions on what you do in terms of experimenting. So in the social sciences, we tend to work off of observations, not experimentation. This is probably one of the biggest differences between the physical sciences and the social sciences. It's this, what I'm calling this observational constraint. We're constrained to observation, to observing people doing things in their own setting, not in a laboratory. Another thing that comes in is, we want to predict the future, but we can only do it with information from the past, right? And this is another thing that goes along with, it goes along very much with just being empirical, right? We're trying to look at the world, and so we are very often interested in what's going to happen in the future, right? We want to know, does being a democracy, stop you from going to war with other democracies? Oh, got that one out. But the point is, we can't tell whether that's the future. We have to look at the past to see whether or not that was the case in the past. And very often with our predictive models, you test it by trying to predict the past, right? And so again, we are constrained by what has happened, by predicting the future with what's past, and by being limited to the observations we have of individuals and events in the past. Which of course means that we have a data availability problem, right? What data is there out there? And it very often, a researcher in social science is dependent on data previously collected by others. And that's okay. There's a lot of data out there, but you're often missing data. Whenever you're using someone else's data set, you can be missing data because there may be cases that weren't considered or weren't available. You can be missing variables, right? When people collect data, they collect so many variables, and the variable you're interested in might not be there. And trust me, I have done research where I use Pew Research polls, and there's a question about how people think about free trade, whether it's been good for the country or not. That's my dependent variable. Well, sometimes they include that in a survey, and other times they don't. And then when they do include that in the survey, have they included questions that measure the independent variables that I'm interested in, the causal factors, right? I think something affects people's attitudes towards trade, their assessments of whether trade was good for the country. Well, I have just this huge problem of when trying to look at these things, they don't always have the same questions in each survey. And so sometimes it's hit or miss, and it can be really, really frustrating because you have missing variables. You have this problem of consistency. Right? Are we consistently asking questions the same way? Are we consistently measuring things in the same manner? And so these are some of the real thorny issues, practical issues that come up when doing social science research. We also have a problem of small n, right? A lot of the things we look at are, in fact, infrequent events, even though they occur fairly often. In the terms of trying to do statistical testing and collecting data, and statistics, by the way, when you're being observational, statistics is what you got to use to see whether your observations really amount to anything, right? And so that's why we go to statistics as part of our observational approach rather than experimentation. But you need a certain number of observations to be confident that a trend is actually a trend. And also to sort out the effect of multiple variables, you need what we call degrees of freedom. And that usually requires more cases with more variation. When you don't have a lot of cases, when there's always n is the number of cases in any data set, you have a problem. And so things like wars, I mean, there have been a lot of wars, but not that many. Presidential elections. There have been a fair number of presidential elections, but we only have one every 4 years. So it's a small data set. And it can, that really makes things difficult when predicting what's going to happen. Especially that's something that Nate Silver often talks about when he's trying to forecast presidential elections. He said, look, we actually have a very small data set. We aren't too sure about what happens. Big problem. Speaking of big, there's also big data. This is something that's interesting, that we are seeing more and more data at an individual level. So there is this new area out there where you can go into big data, and big data refers to the information that is collected on people and through just electronic means. And so kind of like logs, how many cell phone calls. I saw social sociologists looking at the question of who contacts who in a relationship, and they got cell phone data for people, and it was anonymized, but they could tell who's related to who and gender. They didn't know who anyone was, but they could see, okay, within families, who's calling who, right? And they found that women tended to initiate the calls to men. And, when they saw people in the same plan, and they could look at it, and they had millions of data points though. So, and they were able to kind of track some, talk about some interesting things about relationships that way. So big data is kind of a new area, but, you've got to be clever about how you use it to figure out, all right, the idea of who calls who in terms of an indicator of the dynamics of a relationship within a family, right? That's being clever. And that's what I mean by the art of political science research, framing questions in ways and figuring out with the data what you can answer is very difficult. Then there's conceptual complexity, right? We have a lot of social concepts out there that can be, well, one, they can be subjective, right? We have subjectivity as an assessment. We also have intersubjective, right? When subjective means someone has a concept, right? Someone, and usually the things that are subjective are personal evaluations of policy. Do we think this is good? Do we think that, people make judgments? For instance, I was talking about my dependent variable, whether or not trade was good for the country, right? That's a subjective assessment that people were doing, and that's what I was studying there. We can have intersubjective things. Those are shared meanings or shared evaluations between people. And that's the kind of thing constructivists look at, right? So we can also get abstract or vague things. Democracy. What is democracy? And, people like to talk about what is terrorism, right? And your meaning can, in the abstract, might be clear, but nailing it down and developing what aspects of democracy do you want included in there. And it turns out democracy has a lot of facets to it. It's not just electing somebody because, well, the Kim Jong-un is elected in Korea every year, right? But so it's an election that's free and fair, but you have to have civil rights. You have to have political rights. There are a whole bunch of aspects to it that are again, complex, but the abstract concept is, I like to say it's a bit vague. And then when we try to nail it down, we get into, well, what do we mean by this? What do we mean by that? Then we also have the concept of, do ideas change over time? Our conceptions of human rights, our conceptions of what states can do, the limits of sovereignty, right? We have a lot of concepts that evolve and change over time. So that is something else that makes life interesting for social science research. So what do we do? Right? What's the overarching thing? One, it's important to understand that we're going to focus on causal relationships between variables. One of the things about the social science approach is to think in terms of variables, to think in terms of every event or phenomena is a observation in a category of observations or a set of observations, and that each event or phenomena has characteristics that can be consistently measured, but that will vary between cases. And these are what we call variables. And we like to talk about what's the relationship between variables, right? What's the relationship between a country being a democracy and whether or not it goes to war? Well, one of those is the thing we're interested in explaining, right? War, by the way, in that case. And that's a dependent variable. The question is, what's the causal thing? What's the factor that that dependent variable depends on, right? That's the independent variable. So that's one thing that we definitely do. In approaching this, we theorize about cause and effect, right? This is, just stepping back and saying, one thing that we have to do that's important is theorize. We have to understand the causal relationships between variables. We have to understand the code. I always talk like in the Matrix, right? You got to understand what's going on behind everything, right? And so theory and theoretical research is about laying out explanations of the world, identifying cause and effect relationships. Then we empirically test hypotheses derived from those theories. So we say, look, if that theory is right, then we should see this. This is something we should observe. If that's the fire, here's the smoke we should see in the world. And so we empirically test hypotheses derived from that. And so this overarching approach is what I'm calling the art of political science research. One, we have a course at Troy that's named for that, but there's so much that isn't in a methods textbook. A methods textbook will generally only talk about this last bit. How do you test a hypothesis? But conceiving of the world in terms of variables is a first step, right? That's something you've got to get used to. And then theorizing, you got to have theory to test, to develop hypotheses and to test things. And so then we get to the empirical testing that's so important. We don't just think this is the way the world works and go off of a couple anecdotes that seem to support our case. We go out and test the theories. We try to see, as Riker said, we utter sentences about reality, that's theory, and then we do something to, prove it's right, but we test whether it's right. That's the art of political science research. Hope that makes sense.